This video is sponsored by Skillshare. More to come on that shortly. So, Crofty, after both of us being somewhat worse for wear in the last episode, we are back from the dead, so to speak, to try again.
Yes, we are indeed. Unfortunately not resurrected to eternal life by Osiris like we'd hoped.
No, it's back to the old-fashioned digging through the dirt to escape our coffins, because in our absence our loved ones stepped in and did the decent thing and had us buried. Which, of course, we're now going to hold a grudge against them for and drain their blood.
Yeah, or I would, but I'm having a bit of a problem with that.
No?
Well, you know how normally vampires aren't supposed to be able to cross a threshold without being invited in?
Yes.
When I get invited in, I'm like, oh, no, don't go into any bother. I wouldn't want to impose. No.
Yes.
Don't want to do any of that. And so I've not actually fed since I got resurrected.
That's a bit of a problem. What you have to just do is just like make them feel obligated to offer you just half a pint of their blood, just to get you started. You know, oh go on.
I use my politeness against them.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, well, I don't want to intrude, but it would be rude of me not to drain you for everything I possibly can. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mythillogical. My name is Charles. I'm joined today, I can't say by my ghoul sidekick Crofty, because he appears to have been promoted. And we're here once again to ramble on about all things folklore and mythology for far, far, far too long.
Well, we do kind of have eternity now, so...
Exactly, and what better way to spend eternity than talking about today's topic? So at the end of our last episode, Crofty, we outlined roughly what the next subject was going to be, and I think we have to say we probably went down the wrong foxhole, so to speak, in terms of what we were intending to do.
Yes, I was asked to give a hint, and on the spot my options were to mention Wallachia or to hum the Buffy theme, and my lungs were not up to the Buffy theme that day.
Exactly, so we ended up hinting that we were going to do what particular topic, Crofty?
Vampires, as you may have guessed from the opening to this episode.
Indeed, and we're kind of covering vampires with a little bit of a twist, because almost everyone out there is going to be familiar in some fashion with the more modern idea of a vampire as a refined count or gentleman, possibly also having something of a seductive element, in addition to being a undead bloodsucker. What we want to focus on in this particular podcast episode is the actual folklore associated with vampires, because what we discovered is that basically the modern image that we have of the vampire has very, very little to do with actual folklore. So, for example, in the course of our hint for the last episode, we mentioned a certain Vlad Tepes, or better known as Vlad the Impaler, who was a prince of Wallachia in, I believe, the 15th century, and who I kind of affectionately referred to as Vladislav the Poker. Let's see who gets that reference. And what we really discovered is that when it comes to vampire folklore, Vlad the Impaler doesn't really come into things. There are various bloodthirsty legends that are associated with him in the centuries after his death, but from what I can tell, his modern association with the figure of the vampire really didn't come into things until the more modern literary creation of the vampire, which dates from the early 19th century onwards. So in the course of this episode, we're going to be focusing on discovering a strain of vampirism that runs both much older and much deeper than the modern Bram Stoker image of the vampire. However, Crofty, that decision I think leaves us in a bit of a pickle, doesn't it? Because it turns out there are a vast number of different entities that people over time have claimed to be vampires of one form or another across the world.
Yes, I in particular had a similar experience here than we had with Wild Hunt, in which I found quite a lot of references to creatures described as vampires from various countries. And when looking further into it, found that that connection was tenuous at best and non-existent at worst.
Yeah, I think from the way you described it to me when we were messaging back and forth discussing how we were going to structure this episode, I had this vision in my head of like this, a Scooby-Doo episode where you've got the bad guy tied up at the end of the episode going, ha, we're going to rip off the mask and figure out who's really responsible. And you whip off the mask and you go, oh, it's you again, colonialism.
And who's that assistant of yours? Christianity.
Yes. So that sounds like it's going to be an interesting experience. One thing that we've done to kind of narrow down the topic a little bit is what we've done is we've gone and selected a couple of different criteria to use in order to define what we consider to be a vampire. So, Crofty, I believe you can give us those criteria.
Yes, it's two quite simple criteria. One is that they must be undead, and the other is that they must feed on blood. We're allowing a bit of leeway in that certain creatures will feed on some sort of mysterious life force, because often that does tend to get associated with blood in religion, in various forms of mythology and mysticism. And in terms of being undead, I think in some cases we can allow very unnaturally extending life rather than dying and coming back, but that might be a case-by-case basis.
I must admit, I've also gone into some entities that don't exactly fit the mold, but I think are quite useful in helping to set up some later ideas of vampirism. But otherwise, we've tried to be quite specific about what we're going to cover in this episode.
Yeah, so as a spoiler, a lot of my section will be, and this is why this creature that is called a vampire really isn't a vampire.
Yeah. So from how we've been describing it so far, you can probably tell we've split up where in the world we're going to be looking for these particular creatures. So the original plan was going to be that I would cover the European traditions of vampirism and possibly older traditions that may come by way of the ancient Near East. However, in practice, I largely ended up focusing almost entirely on Eastern European traditions associated with vampires. So that's really where I'm going to be coming from on this. Crofty, however, you're going to be focusing on basically vampiric entities or claimed vampiric entities from around the rest of the world.
Yes, it will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, because a lot of these entities, there's a very limited amount of reliable information to go on, but I've tried to be as thorough as possible.
I've had almost the exact opposite problem where I had so much material where I probably could have written a script that went on for, 10 hours or something like that. It really, for me, was a case of pick and choose what I end up including. So with that in mind, it's probably a good moment for us to mention our sources for this episode, because looking at how patchy in some ways my account inevitably has had to be of a reasonable time for a podcast, people may want to go off and explore some of the threads I touch upon more in their own time. So my sources for today, the main source was The Vampire, A New History by Nick Groom, which is a pretty authoritative account of vampires from their folkloric and ancient roots all the way through to modern concepts of the vampire. In addition to this, I also looked at Vampires, Burial and Death, Folklore and Reality by Paul Barber, which was a really good account for having some of the first-hand reports of vampire scares that I will discuss shortly. Alongside this, I also used some sections from the book Vampire Forensics, uncovering the origins of an enduring legend by Mark Collins Jenkins. And I used some very small sections from Mummies, Cannibals and Vampires by Richard Sugg. And then the very last thing to mention is I did use a copy of an article called Vampirism in Medicine by N. Kluger, B. Cribier, and B. Haluiak. The slight problem with this article is it was entirely in French, so I basically went through the Google Translate version, because it turns out you can now drop documents into Google Translate and it will translate PDFs for you, which is kind of cool. So basically, if anyone wants a copy of that, hit me up on Twitter and I'll send over the brute force translated version that I have.
And I realise I should have cleared this with you beforehand, Charles, but for my section, I am going to have to reference as I go, just because as I covered the entire world and such a massive variety of creatures, the references are just scattered all over the place. There's things where I will be saying there's no reliable source. I just kept finding mention of this without backup, things like that. So I will keep my references as I go. We'll say where I've had to just use something that I could not find a good source for and to take that bit with a pinch of salt. Hopefully it'll be coherent enough.
Yeah, as we've had in the past with this podcast, sometimes with folklore, the references can be somewhat unreliable, so that's understandable. And before we go on, Crofty, I would like to take a moment just to thank this episode's sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes to explore. Whether you're looking to get the most out of a hobby, or you would like to turn your interests into a profession, Skillshare can provide you with classes at every skill level. Something I hear online a lot is people saying that they could never turn their own hobbies into a successful YouTube channel. So, at the risk of creating more competition for Crofty and myself, today I'm going to highlight a Skillshare course that will show you how you can do just that. The tech YouTuber Marques Brownlee, also known as MKBHD, is a tech YouTuber with over 15 million subscribers, and he's sharing his secrets with the course YouTube Success, Script, Shoot, and Edit with MKBHD. In this course, he walks you through coming up with an initial idea, how to research, write, shoot, and edit your videos, and even gives you some tips on how to promote and grow your channel. Marques is entirely self-taught, going from creating videos in his parents' basement to leading a full team of professionals, and you can get the benefit of his experience to help you build your own channel. And outside of video production, Skillshare has classes on a wide range of topics, including art and design, writing, crafts, music, and productivity, all of which are great skills to bring to your YouTube career, or are just fun ways to exercise your creativity. Skillshare provides an uninterrupted learning experience, meaning no ads, and they are always launching new premium classes. With short video lessons designed to fit any schedule, projects to keep you focused and engaged, and a large community of fellow creatives around the world, you'll always be able to find the engagement and inspiration you need to bring your projects to fruition. And if that wasn't enough, the first 1,000 subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can start exploring your creativity today. So before we properly get started, the last thing for me to say is if you want to keep up to date with what this podcast is doing, head over to twitter.com/the_histocrat, where I occasionally give updates as to what future topics for videos are going to be, and just generally post anything that comes into my head. In addition to this, if you're listening to this podcast on the audio formats that are out there, which can be found on places like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and all those good places, you can also head on over to youtube.com/thehistocrat, where usually a couple of months after the audio version came out, we also have a video version with all sorts of additional images to complement our descriptions. Then the final thing to mention is that this podcast is supported by a small Patreon. So if you want to go over to patreon.com/thehistocrat, over there you can support the channel directly and help us devote more time to focusing on future episodes. So in addition to those criteria, Crofty, what's also kind of interesting is the figures we're going to be talking about really don't have many of the traits that are associated with a modern vampire. So do you want to give us some examples of those?
Yes, because it turns out Bram Stoker was very imaginative in some of the things that he came up with, and a lot of these have replaced older vampire folklore in how we see vampires now. A few of these traits do actually, strangely enough, pop up in little references outside of Europe that we'll discover later. One thing that will probably surprise some listeners is that the idea of vampires having fangs was largely a literary creation. There are some people who think that this may have crossed over from the werewolves of folklore, but a more likely explanation is more for the artistic image, in that it's a way of creating the modern image of biting the neck, which is quite often given erotic undertones, or overtones in some cases. Doing so to keep the wounds as small and clean as possible, because if one is biting the neck with regular human teeth, that gets much more messy than any sort of cinema would like to have.
It's pretty gruesome, yeah.
In fact, as well as just the fangs, pretty much any idea of a vampire being so precise and clean and civilized, I guess, is pretty much entirely a literary creation. None of the vampires of folklore that I've read about, I'm sure you might prove me wrong at some point here, Charles, but I don't think any of them really had the intellect or the civility that we see in Dracula, and that they're mostly driven by hunger.
Yeah, in my case, I will say I probably don't have anything to contradict you with, because on my end, it's mostly hairy guys all the way down.
Ah, good. I was expecting to instantly get it. No, you're wrong there. Moment. This idea of them not being particularly intelligent and mostly driven by instinct, it does also rule out the image of them sleeping in coffins or the need for them to rest in their native soil, because generally folkloric vampires didn't have the presence of mind to seek out a specific sleeping place.
Yeah, and indeed the idea of a vampire travelling that far from his resting place is very much a literary idea.
Exactly. Generally they are much more predators rather than intelligent creatures. That also automatically rules out certain magical abilities like hypnosis or turning into a bat or dissolving into mist, which are entirely from the mind of Bram Stoker. Additionally, a lot of the weaknesses that we know of are all entirely literary creations. For example, the obvious one being unable to cross a threshold without being invited, as again, requires the civility to understand what a threshold is. Though there is one creature that I'll mention later from elsewhere in the world that can't cross a threshold, but we will see that that is for entirely practical reasons. It's quite common for vampires to only be active at night, which is quite logical because these stories may have come from sightings of people or creatures that scared people and that their minds created this larger-than-life image for. But the idea of burning up in the sunlight is, again, entirely fictional. One weakness that does have a bit of a grounding in folklore is the use of garlic to ward away vampires. But in the folklore, it's less specific. I mean, other strong smells could be used.
Usually it's a pungent odour is the key factor rather than actually being garlic.
Yeah, that's it. It came more from beliefs that plague was spread by miasma, and so strong smells such as garlic or spices would keep this miasma away. One weakness that, again, does have a bit of a grounding in real folklore, the idea of crosses and Christian imagery as a weakness, but that is more just because any generic encounter with something evil in Europe, people would raise their crucifix, cross themselves, and recite "The Lord is my shepherd" as a matter of course, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a specific to vampires thing. With that, I think that's covered all of the major things that we won't be discussing for the rest of the episode. And so I'll hand over to you, Charles.
Okay. So before we get into actual vampire folklore, as I hinted before, I thought it would be good for me to just kind of set the scene by very briefly mentioning some of the major bloodsuckers and undead of antiquity that existed in both the Middle East and Europe, who may have exerted some influence on the later folk traditions that became the vampire. So evil creatures that are known to prey on either the flesh or the blood of living humans are probably as old as humanity itself, as is the fear of the dead returning in some fashion. The earliest known accounts we have of creatures that are said to subsist at least partially on the flesh of the living include figures such as the biblical Lilith, who in some later literature is said to have been the rebellious first wife of Adam, who later went on to be characterized as something of a demonic entity that was often said to prey on children. So there is some argument that her name is actually based on an older tradition. So it has been argued that the name Lilith shares some form of origin with the Sumerian and Akkadian word Lilu, which is generally thought to mean either demon or spirit. So I came across that from when I was making my Gilgamesh video over on the Historycrat YouTube channel. I think in one version of the Sumerian Kings list, Gilgamesh's father is listed as a demon or a spirit, and it uses that term. However, in recent years, there have been some challenges by scholars to the idea of this connection at all, so it may just be a coincidence of names. Going beyond these sort of figures, we also have creatures such as the Lamia of ancient Greece, who, according to the earliest accounts of Greek mythology, was said to have been a queen of Libya, who had an affair with Zeus. There's that guy again. And whose children were stolen from her by Hera as a form of revenge. So in despair, the Lamia is then said to have snatched up and consumed any children she came across, and it was through these acts that she was transformed into a monster that, in most representations, usually has some form of serpentine aspect. The term of the Lamia also later became synonymous with figures known as the Empusai. These were shape-shifting beings that were quite similar to the later succubi, but they were mostly marked out by having the single feature of a bronze leg. In ancient Greece and Rome, we also see demonic entities such as the Strix and the Striga, which later became associated with the consumption of human flesh and blood. So in the case of the Strix, this creature was usually envisioned more as a type of bird, commonly an owl of some type, and whilst it was conceived by the ancient Greeks as some form of monstrosity, it wasn't necessarily bloodthirsty in its earliest incarnations. So according to Antonius Liberalis's Metamorphoses, not to be confused with Ovid's Metamorphoses, these Strix were created when the woman Polyphonte and her cannibal sons, who I believe had been sired by bears, were turned into owl-like creatures who never ate or drank, but cried during the night, and whose cry was an ill omen for mankind that often portended war or plague. However, by the turn of the 1st century AD, the Strix seems to have been reconceived as a bloodthirsty creature that indeed murdered children. So according to an account found in one of Ovid's other works, the Fasti, the Strigi targeted the legendary king Procas of the Etruscan city of Alba Longa in his cradle whilst he was a baby, and whilst the creatures were successfully driven off, the attack left him with lifelong scars across his cheeks. Later on, as we move through the later parts of the Roman period and into the early medieval period, the terms Lamia, Strix, and indeed the term Striga came to be used to mean both witches and evil spirits in general. So I know this term Striga in particular became associated with malevolent women who were said to be able to fly and who were engaged in cannibalism. So these words would continue to be used in this fashion into the early medieval period, although generally there seems to have been something of an opposition by the Christian Church to the idea that many of these entities existed at all. I think I mentioned this to you before, Crofty. I had a bit of a coincidence whilst I was preparing for this episode because I'm currently writing a script that involves large sections of early Christian Ireland, and in one of the early church documents from there, which is known as the First Synod of St. Patrick, belief in both the Lamia and the Striga are named as a potential reason for excommunication. The one thing I should probably point out is that the actual translation of the version I used substituted the word vampire for Striga in its texts. However, as we're going to see later, and that will become important, the word vampire didn't actually exist in the Latin language or the English language in any form, and indeed wouldn't do until the early 18th century. So moving beyond these figures, we also have examples of the Restless Dead that are found throughout Northern European folklore. Probably the most prominent of these are in the Icelandic sagas, such as Grettir's saga, and I did look up this name, but I cannot remember how to pronounce it now. Eyjabíja saga. The Restless Dead are known as Draugr, or barrow dwellers, and largely appear both as the guardians of ancient hoards and as beings that occasionally sallied forth from tombs and attacked the living. These figures were said to be, less of a case of spirits that possessed dead bodies and more a case of the restless spirit of the dead individual that was motivated by both wealth and greed, attempting to remain as corporeal as possible. So anyone who has played the game Skyrim is probably quite aware of what the appearance of these creatures is supposed to look like, because it's quite similar to that as described in the sagas. So generally, Draugr, or whites, were characterized by their combination of superhuman strength, their appearance of being death blue or black, and also some of them were said to possess magical powers to the point where they were even immune to conventional weapons.
I'm sort of imagining the artwork that you see of Tolkien's Barrow Wights, or like the Games Workshop models of Tolkien's Barrow Wights.
Yeah.
That basically matches the description that you've just given.
Well, speaking of Tolkien, I also have a quick throwaway reference to a work which he produced a translation of in his youth, which is in the work Beowulf. The monstrous being Grendel is also similarly described as being a bloodsucker, and specifically is said to have cannibalized the bodies of the men he slays before his contention with Beowulf. So the final couple of entities I just want to mention quickly before we move on to actual vampire folklore are a couple that I hinted at earlier. So in the 15th and the 16th century works of the Malleus Maleficarum of Heinrich Kramer, and the Demonology of King James I and 6th of England, Scotland, and Ireland, respectively, would describe seductive demons known both as the incubi, which are the male version, and the succubi. So these figures were largely said to attempt to seduce innocents into engaging in sexual activity with them. However, there are also examples where these creatures are said to feed upon the flesh of their victims, or to in other ways cause them misfortune, such as ill health or even death. And I think there are some kind of useful parallels that can be drawn between male vampires and the traditions I'm going to talk about, and the incubi in particular. So in addition to these creatures that can kind of be seen as embodying some of the traits that folkloric vampires would go on to have, we also probably have to take into account that around the time these stories were active in Europe, blood itself played some very unusual roles in the practice of both ancient and medieval medicine. Probably the most notable practice that we should point to is, during this entire period, the pseudoscientific practice of bloodletting remained common. So this practice potentially dates back to ancient Egyptian times. The first really concrete descriptions we have of it date to the 5th century BC, when it was mentioned as a contemporary treatment by the Greek physician Hippocrates. Although, from what I read, he himself apparently relied more on rest and dietary treatments rather than such a practice. So this theory of bloodletting was based on the then existing humoral theory, which thought that the body contained 4 major humors, which were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And imbalances between these 4 different humors often were thought to result in illness. As a result, many medical treatments were based around keeping these humors in proper balance, and usually consisted of inducing practices such as vomiting, administering diuretics, or of course bloodletting to keep their respective humors at an acceptable level. So throughout the Middle Ages, this practice of bloodletting was reinforced due to the influence of the writings of the 2nd and 3rd century AD Greek physician and philosopher Galen, whose ideas on anatomy dominated for more than a millennium. I think some of them persisted as long as the 16th century AD. So Galen was a subscriber to the humoral theory of more ancient Greeks. However, he thought that in particular the blood was the most abundant of the humors, and thus was the most in need of control. And that in addition to removing it through the practice of bloodletting, it could also become stagnant in the extremities of the body and would thus require specialized methods for its removal. The result of all this was that bloodletting would remain a common treatment and would be elaborated on with blood being taken from specific parts of the body well into the 19th century, and it did not actually die out until the early 20th century. And what's probably useful for us is that bloodletting was at its absolute peak as a medical tool in the 17th and the 18th centuries, which is when the concept of vampirism became more widely known throughout Europe. I will say what I also found kind of interesting, and this is a little off topic, was during the course of researching this, I found out that bloodletting is still used in a legitimate medical fashion. So it's mostly used for the treatment of specific blood disorders, which result in things like an accumulation of too much iron in the blood. So bloodletting is in fact still technically alive and going today.
So's leeching as well, interestingly.
Yeah.
Similar reasons.
Yeah, it turned out there was something useful there, just not in the fashion it was being used.
Yeah, it's specific reasons, not just bloodlet for everything.
So beyond this practice of bloodletting, blood was also used throughout history as a potential medical cure in itself. Specifically, in some ways, it was supposed to have rejuvenating powers. So, as far back as the Roman period, Pliny the Elder claimed that people suffering from epilepsy would drink the blood of freshly slain gladiators in the hopes that this would result in a cure. I will say that Pliny is a little bit of an unreliable source, not just in terms of, the unreliability of the cure, but also the report in itself. So maybe just take that one with a pinch of salt. In the 12th century AD, St. Hildegard of Bingen recommended baths of menstrual blood in order to cure leprosy in a similar fashion, whilst in the 15th century, the occultist Marsilio Ficino would claim that witches frequently took part in blood-sucking, writing that, quote, "It is an ancient and common opinion that certain crones, called witches, suck the blood of infants in order to rejuvenate themselves as best they can. Then why might not our elderly, finding themselves all but without hope of survival, suck the blood of a lad? Of a lad, I say, of stalwart forces, healthy, cheerful, well-tempered, excellent blood that might be by happy chance excessive. Let them such then like a leech, that is a bloodsucker, from a slightly opened vein in the skinny part of the arm, an ounce or two, then immediately take the same amount of syrup or wine. This should be done precisely when they are hungry and thirsty, and at the waxing of the moon." So to conclude this kind of section on the supposed properties attributed to blood in both ancient and medieval times, I have two notable cases where blood was used as a claimed revitalizing treatment. Now, one of these might be based on fact. The other is frequently claimed as factual, but is now thought to almost certainly be based on a conspiracy and later stories that then grew up around the incident. And indeed, this story is frequently associated with vampires, so I thought it was appropriate to include it. In the first case, it is often claimed that the 5th century Pope, Innocent VIII, was treated with blood on his deathbed after suffering a stroke. So, according to the account of Stefano Infessura, an attempt to rejuvenate the ailing Pope was made by oral administration of the collected blood of 3 separate youths, each of whom died during the process. Unfortunately for the Pope, however, these efforts were unsuccessful, and he died soon after. A lot of the sources I consulted in the course of this episode basically printed this account pretty much verbatim. It should be pointed out, however, that the main source for this account was basically one of the harshest critics of this Pope, so it's entirely possible that he just completely fabricated this just to, basically kick the guy whilst he was dead. I also will point out that that particular Pope was a major opponent of witchcraft and practices during his lifetime, so it sounds unlikely, but with the state of medicine at the time, it is possible, I guess. The second case, and probably the most famous case there is of the claimed revitalizing uses of blood in history, is associated with the case of Countess Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth Báthory and her wider family were major landowners throughout the then Kingdom of Hungary. I think her most influential relative was King Stephen Báthory, who was king of neighbouring Poland-Lithuania, and was also Prince of Transylvania. So in 1610, Elizabeth Báthory was accused by the ruling Habsburg authorities of being a major serial killer who was allegedly responsible for torturing to death up to 650 of her young female servants, a crime for which she was imprisoned in her castle until her death in 1614. And the later most famous piece of folklore that was attached to her is that she was specifically claimed to have bathed in the blood of her virgin victims, in the hope that this would rejuvenate her appearance. However, it should be said again, these accounts date from well after her death, and it is now also thought by a good number of scholars that these claims and the resulting trial may have been a spectacle that was designed to destroy her and her family's power in the region. And given that this was a region that bordered on Austria, this would have been an act that very much benefited the ruling Habsburg dynasty. In particular, it's also said that the emperor of the time, which I believe was Matthias, was actually in debt to the Batoris, so that may also include a potential motive. This account is also frequently linked to Bram Stoker's later depiction of vampires. There isn't any actual evidence of this, however. So, for example, I don't think any reference to this actually appears in his known notes. So, this may just be a later association that's kind of been made in pop culture. So, the one other thing I think that should be briefly mentioned, and I mean very briefly mentioned before we go into the actual folklore, was that in the case of murders in medieval Europe, it was often thought that blood could be used in some ways to help distinguish the potential murderer. So it was often said, for example, that a corpse would bleed in the presence of their killer, and often this blood would be impossible to remove. I haven't gone into this in a lot of detail, but I will point out that this particular attribute does appear in the plays of Shakespeare, for example. So, getting into the actual folklore that surrounds vampires, the major accounts of vampires in Europe, or more specifically the panics that they inspired, came out of Eastern Europe from the 17th and the 18th centuries onwards, with the first major vampire craze, so to speak, occurring throughout wider Europe during the 1730s. However, it should be noted that these accounts really only present a fairly late, unified image of what constituted a vampire, and in reality there is evidence that the region has had a fairly rich body of concerns regarding the reanimation of the dead since at least the medieval period. So for an example of this, in the 14th century, the Serbian emperor Stefan Dušan would issue as part of his law code a general ban on unlawful exhumation, which read, "When it happens that by magical means people are taken out of their graves and cremated, the village where that was done must pay a fine, and the priest who came to the cremation must be deprived of his vocation." So it's from law codes such as this that you can infer that such practices of disinterring the dead who were suspected of being some form of creature may well have been endemic to the region, but that is just an inference. The exact origin of the English word vampire is itself an uncertain one. As Nick Groom notes in his work, it could originate from a number of different Slavic words. The most commonly mentioned candidates are the Russian term, I think, of upir, or possibly the Lithuanian words of vamti, which is supposed to mean to drink, or vamiti, which apparently means barking or yammering. Other words for specific vampiric entities throughout the region include the strigoi of Romanian folklore, the vampir of Serbia and Croatia, the Albanian striga, and the Polish strizga, or striziga, sorry. This is only a small sampling of the various terms that are associated with vampires in this region. I mostly want to point that many of these terms that I've just mentioned there are said to be derived from the earlier Roman term of striga, but the exact route by which this transmission would have been made is not 100% certain. It is most commonly stated, however, that this transmission likely came through Greece and through the wider Balkans further into Eastern Europe. So, in addition to this, we also see terms such as the Serbian term of vukodlaki, which is often used in an overlapping fashion to mean either a vampire or a werewolf. In Greece and Macedonia, there's similarly an entity known as the vrikolakas, which is commonly equated to the vampires of Eastern Europe, although it should be pointed out that in most accounts, the vrikolakas hungers more for human flesh and for livers rather than for blood. However, both the circumstances that lead to the creation of this creature and the methods that are claimed to destroy it are almost identical to those that have been claimed for other vampiric entities, so I have decided to include it here. So that, on the whole, is just a small selection of the various terms that I use throughout these regions. I'm aware there are other terms also used in areas such as Belarus. I just wanted to give a good sampling of them here because, again, if I went into all the local traditions and variants of vampires, I would be here for hours. For the sake of this episode, when it comes to describing the more general picture of an Eastern European or Slavic vampire, I am going to largely stick to the generalities. However, where specific instances come up and are relevant, I will try to go into those to give a bit more of a flavour of how these figures can vary. So, the picture of a vampire that is derived from most Eastern European folklore, as we described earlier, bears very little resemblance to the image of the refined, long-toothed gentleman count that we see in most media today. That's because instead of the long teeth, as Crofty said, most folkloric vampires are marked by a flushed or healthy coloured or even a dark face, the presence of fresh blood around their mouth, and a body that is swollen from their recent feeding. In addition to this, unlike their literary counterparts, in most of the reports that I found in the course of my research, the actual vampire itself is usually encountered not when it's out and mobile, but when it is resting as a corpse within its grave. So in many of the reports that describe vampires throughout these regions, when it comes to determining whether or not a particular corpse is in fact a vampire, there usually are a number of general criteria. Amongst the most important of these are that there be a presence of a freshness or a lack of decomposition or stench about the body. In addition, the continued growth of the hair or the nails, or alternatively the shedding of the nails to reveal new nails growing below, were thought to be signs of a vampire. In addition, if a corpse sheds its outer layer of skin to reveal a pale layer below, then this is also considered a potential mark of vampirism. So according to Paul Barber, there is also a Slavic tradition where a corpse found with an open mouth may be a vampire. He actually points to an example of, in all things, the novel War and Peace. There is an instance in there where the elder Prince Bolonsky actually has his mouth tied shut after he dies, and he attempted to argue in his work that this was done due to a fear of potential vampirism, but I don't know if that actually is the case or not. Another commonly reported trait of both Slavic and Germanic vampires is the presence of a white liver within the corpse, which is usually thought to be due to a deficiency of bile. And finally, probably the most important trait of all is the presence of either liquid blood within the corpse or within the grave or on the grave clothes. So after a person died and became a vampire, the newborn creature was often said to consume its own grave clothes and shroud, and sometimes to even tear at its own flesh and to rip out its bowels. After remaining in its coffin for a period, the vampire would then leave its grave in search of victims. Often it was said that it would start with its own kin. A male vampire in particular would often seek to have sex with his wife, with any offspring that were conceived as a result being largely marked by having no skeleton. In most of these accounts, the vampire is usually male, however there are a few female ones that do pop up. As you mentioned before, Crofty, where the modern image of a vampire has a vampire being unable to enter a particular residence until it's invited inside, that is not found in the Slavic tradition of a vampire in the slightest. In fact, in these traditions, a vampire was capable of entering the home through any gap, no matter how small, and once it did so, it would not in fact attempt to kill its victims by draining their blood directly, and often would not even kill using its teeth. Instead, most would instead suffocate their victim. So this would be done either by actively strangling them, or in areas such as Bulgaria, this was done by the vampire sitting on their chest until they expired. And often only then would the vampire proceed to drain the victim's blood. Amongst the vampires that did bite their victims, the area of biting often tended to vary. Sometimes victims would be bitten over the left breast, over the heart, or the nipple, and sometimes even between their eyes. So, in addition to these disruptive activities, vampires were also often considered to be general harbingers of ill omen for a community. Often they were thought to act as vectors for illnesses such as the plague. What we should probably also note is that throughout much of European history, and during the time of these reports first came out of Eastern Europe, the idea that an illness could circulate independently of any physical force wasn't really a concept. So as you mentioned before, Crofty, the idea of there being a miasma, for example, that would spread illness or a form of bad air was ascribed to. And the idea that illness could just circulate independent of some sort of force or some form of divine retribution didn't really develop until towards the end of the 18th century. So as a result, it's somewhat unsurprising that a vampire would be considered a suitable agent to explain the spread of an otherwise invisible contagion. So the folklorist Claude Lécuchet, who I believe we mentioned in the Wild Hunt episode, has also attempted to argue that the emergence of vampire outbreaks in the wider European consciousness came right as the European witch hunts were dying down, and as such, their popularity from the 18th century onwards may have been because they provided a convenient replacement to explain the outbreak of the plague. An ironic note to add to all this is that vampire blood itself was actually occasionally considered to have restorative properties, despite the problems associated with vampires themselves. And often it was specifically said that it could be used to cure someone who themselves had contracted vampirism, which I will mention in the form of an example later. So the exact ways in which a vampire could be created differed throughout Eastern Europe. Common reasons that were given for a person being susceptible to becoming a vampire include that they were murdered, that they drowned, that they committed suicide, that they were the victim of a plague, that they suffered some form of curse in life, or were placed under some form of restriction by a priest, or that they were not accorded the proper burial rites. Often authors tend to group a lot of these reasons under the category of the vampire being someone who has some form of unfinished business in life. Alternatively, people could be born with certain traits that supposedly marked them out as being likely to become a vampire after their death. So, for example, amongst the Polish and the Kashubs of northern Germany, it was said that anyone who was born with, quote, a red cowl over their head, which is usually thought to mean the amniotic membrane, or who is born with 2 teeth, is thought to become a vampire. So other common traits in areas such as Romania and Russia include people who are born with a split lip, an extra nipple, a hairy chest or back, or who are born with a tail-like extension to the spine. In particular, the figure of a Strzyga in Poland could also be marked out by being born with, quote, 2 hearts and 2 sets of teeth. In addition to these predispositions towards becoming a vampire, it was also commonly believed throughout much of Slavic folklore that a corpse could become a vampire if either a person or an animal of some type jumped or flew across it, which I believe, Crofty, we might possibly come across that concept again when you're discussing the idea of vampire-like entities in China.
Yeah, that one does briefly come up, yes.
And then finally, of course, those people who were killed by a vampire were generally thought to also become vampires, along with those who also ate the meat of an animal that was killed by a vampire. So if those are the activities and the potential causes of vampires, how might one go about ridding themselves of such a creature? Well, as with the causes, the exact methods used tend to vary somewhat throughout the regions in which vampire folklore is known. However, the most consistent methods of destroying a vampire were thought to be through either staking the creature through the heart, or in the case of vampires found with their mouths open, through the mouth, or through decapitating the body. So, the type of wood that would be used for these stakes tended to vary between regions. So, in Serbia, hawthorn was generally used, whilst in places like Russia and the Baltic states, ash was the preferred wood, as I think it was in northern Germany as well. After this, in some cases, the body would simply be reinterred, or if it was judged to be necessary, it would be destroyed through cremation. Or in some cases, I think it's even mentioned that it was disposed of by being thrown into a nearby body of water, such as a river. Sometimes the decapitated head would also be reinterred with the body, or would be reinterred separately so that the two could not combine again. Other methods also included driving nails into the body, particularly the forehead, or for the creature's heart to be removed and destroyed. Sometimes, however, all that was really required was for a vampire's body to be reinterred with proper funeral rites being performed. Other methods involve trying to prevent a freshly buried corpse from becoming a vampire. So, a common way of doing this was to place the body in the coffin upside down, which was thought to prevent the vampire from finding its way back up to the surface, or to place some object within the grave that would either remove the vampire's need to come back to life, or that would simply prevent it from coming back at all. A good example of this is how an item, such as a pot shard or a rock, might be placed inside the suspected vampire's mouth. This is usually done so that the creature would chew upon this, rather than chewing upon its shroud or its flesh, or attempting to seek out its kin in order to chew upon them. Alternatively, a brick might be placed under the corpse's chin in order to prevent it from chewing at all, which is similar to the practice of binding to the mouth that we mentioned before. Other practices included placing sharp objects, such as a sickle, in the grave, so that the corpse was prevented from swelling and thus becoming a vampire. In some regions, the sickle was instead said to be placed across the neck, so the creature would decapitate itself should it try to rise, or it was instead used to pierce the corpse's heart. I did see, when I was researching this, I did also kind of see a theory that this may be where some of the later imagery of the Grim Reaper may have come from, but that was just a throwaway thing I saw, and I had not had the chance to verify it, so it could be complete nonsense. But it could be a small kernel of truth there. Often nets and stockings would also be buried with the suspected vampire in order to occupy the creature, and the rationale that it would become obsessed with untying the knots. There were some regions, however, where this generally wasn't done, so this wasn't really done amongst the Kashubs, and it also was not done amongst the Greeks, as they felt that this would prevent the corpse from decomposing properly. So the final category I have here of these sort of methods is methods and items that were designed to ward off vampires. So probably the most common method I found that was used to thwart these creatures was to sprinkle sand, seeds, or other particulate matter either in the grave of the suspected vampire itself or on the path that led to the grave. So this was done because it was thought that the vampire would be forced to count each and every one of these items, and in some accounts this only took place at the rate of 1 a year. So that was thought to be a particularly effective protection.
Wait, the vampire was forced to count things?
Yes, because it was obsessed with them, and it only would count them often at the rate of 1 a year.
Sesame Street had truth to it. 1, ha ha ha. 2. I'm very sorry.
No, it's fine. So a similar practice also involved people sprinkling poppy seeds in each corner of their house, which again was thought to provide a measure of protection against a vampire entering the residence. This was supposedly done due to, of all things, the poppy seed's narcotic effect on the vampire, which would encourage it to sleep. If you know anything about what poppies can be used to make, that sort of makes sense, but the actual amount of narcotic that could possibly be present in a single seed is probably not a lot.
Yeah, you're going to need most of a field.
In addition to this, we also have vampires being warded off by strong smells, as you noted with your comparison to garlic in our criteria at the beginning. One thing that interestingly doesn't really come into folklore surrounding vampires in this region is the effects that mirrors might have on vampires. So in some later versions, vampires are said to have an aversion to mirrors, if only because it can give away that they have no shadow. That does not seem to have been the case in vampire folklore, although in some regions such as Bulgaria, it was thought that exposing a body to a mirror was an ill omen, because by projecting effectively two bodies, you were inviting a further death. Now that we've gone through kind of the generic attributes of a folkloric vampire, let's move on to discuss some more specific examples of supposed vampire outbreaks. Now, these were largely reported at the very end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, and there's a possible reason why that I will get into shortly. So amongst the earliest accounts, we have that of a man by the name of Giogrando, which occurred in 1672. So Grando was a man from Croatian Istria who was said to have risen from the dead as what is described as a lishnam, or a restless corpse, 16 years after his death. So after returning home, he went on to sexually assault his wife and visited his neighbours by knocking on their doors at night, and anyone who was said to have heard that knock, that household was said to be destined to have a death. So after multiple attempts to get rid of him failed, which included an attempted exorcism by the local priest, and multiple attempts to stake him with a hawthorn stick. In fact, I think one encounter it's described where the hawthorn stick was thrown at him as he was encountered on the streets, and it just bounced off his chest. Eventually, his body was exhumed and found to be undecayed, and after another attempt to stake him, he was eventually decapitated, at which point peace returned to the region. A very detailed early 18th century report of such a creature is also given in the work of the botanist Joseph Piton de Tournefort, who described an incident with a Greek Vrikolakas on the island of Mykonos. So this incident, which supposedly dated back to 1701, concerned an unnamed peasant who rose from the dead. In Tournefort's account, we are told that this peasant, who was said to have been a quarrelsome man in life, died by the hands of unknown assailants out in the fields near the town, and was buried in the chapel shortly after. 2 days later, it was made known that this same peasant had been seen out walking during the night, and indeed had come into the homes of the inhabitants, where he engaged in such antics as turning over the furniture, extinguishing the lamps, and embracing people from behind. So at first, the inhabitants were inclined to mostly see this as just harmless fun, which is very strange. But later, some of the more respectable citizens of the town began to complain. And so after a number of meetings, the local town leaders and priests decided to intervene on the 10th day since the corpse was buried. So after saying a mass within the chapel in which the man was interred, the residents had the body disinterred, upon which his heart was cut out and destroyed. I believe Tournefort was actually present for this event, and he claims that due to the great stink that arose from the corpse, incense was burnt within the chapel. However, later some of those present would claim that the resulting smoke came from the corpse itself as it was dissected. Tournefort would note that later residents would also swear that the body was still warm and its blood fresh. However, he and his party claimed to have been situated near the corpse, and according to him, quote, the body was quite adequately dead. If you can't tell, he was very skeptical about the idea that this was a vampire of some sort. So at this point, a crowd arrived who claimed they had been present when the body was transported for burial, and that it did not become stiff upon death, which is another trait attributable to vampires, and as such, it was definitely a true Vrikolakas. So despite this action, the creature apparently remained active and grew only more violent. People claim that he would attack people at night, destroy their property, tear up their clothing, and if he found any liquids that had been left out, he would consume them. So eventually people became so terrorized that many families would leave their homes at night and bed down on pallets in the town square instead. After this, the villagers disinterred the body multiple times, so they ended up filling its mouth with holy water. They planted several swords within the grave until they realized the swords made a crude cross that were preventing the spirit or demon within the creature from escaping. Finally, they eventually brought matters to a head by burning the body on a pyre, upon which points the reports of the creature ceased. So Tournefort basically attributed the whole incident not to any supernatural being, but claims it was an attack of mass hysteria and irrationality by the villagers, and condemns the disinterment as being unlawful. It is also in the early 1720s that we get the first literary account laying out the typical traits of a folkloric vampire, as part of a study of the natural history of Poland, written by the Jesuit priest Father Gabriel Razasinski, himself drawing upon the work of a Father Gengel. In this work, we see the first known account of a Russian upir, which appears to have been drawn from Gengel's accounting of local superstitions, and reads as follows. I have frequently heard from credible eyewitnesses that human bodies have been found not only incorrupt, flexible, and ruddy for a long time, but moreover the head, the mouth, the tongue, and the eyes are sometimes seen to move. The winding sheet in which they are wrapped is undone and parts of the body are devoured. At times it is also noted that a body of this kind rises again from the grave, wanders past crossroads and houses, showing himself now to one, now to another, and also attacks many, trying to suffocate them. If it is a male body, it is called a upir. If it is a female, it is called a upierzicha, as if to say a feathered one, i.e. a body provided with down or feathers, light and agile for movement. The actual widespread popularization of accounts of vampires throughout Europe can be traced to two events that occurred in extension to these in the early 18th century. These took place in the Balkans, much like the events of the early 19th century had a big effect on Europe. For historical context, this initial popularization of vampire attacks came place immediately after the end of the Austro-Turkish War of 1716 to 1718, which ended in the Treaty of Passarowitz. Under the terms of this treaty, the Austrian Habsburg Empire managed to temporarily extend their territory into northern Syria, along with Bosnia and Wallachia, and it is during this period of military occupation by the Austrians that we get the first really heavily documented accounts of vampiric attacks that were recorded by the official authorities. Two accounts that received the most publicity were related to two Serbian men whose respective deaths were said to have unleashed vampiric attacks throughout their local communities. So the first of these men was Peter Blagojevic, also known as Peter Blagojevic, who was a local of the village of Kisilova, who died in 1725 and whose case was investigated by the imperial provisor from Bald. So here is the direct report of his case. It's not too long, so I'm going to give a direct translation of the full report, which reads, after a subject by the name of Peter Blagojevic had died 10 weeks past, he lived in the village of Kisilova in the Ram district and had been buried according to the Reitzian custom. It was revealed that in this same village, within a week, 9 people, both old and young, died also after suffering a 24-hour illness. And they said publicly, while they were yet alive but on their deathbed, the above-mentioned Blagojevic, who had died 10 weeks earlier, had come to them in their sleep, laid himself on them, and throttled them so that they would have to give up the ghost. The other subjects were very distressed and strengthened, even more so in such beliefs, by the fact that the dead Peter Blagojevic's wife, after saying that her husband had come to her and demanded his opanki, or shoes, had left the village of Kisilova and gone to another. And since with such people, which they call vampires, various signs are to be seen, that is, the body undecomposed, the skin, hair, beard, and nails growing, the subjects resolved unanimously to open his grave and see if the above-mentioned signs were really to be found on him. To this end they came here to me, and telling of these events, asked me and the local pope, or parish priest, to be present at the viewing. And although I at first disapproved, telling them that the praiseworthy administration would first be dutifully and humbly informed, and its exalted opinion about this should be heard, they did not want to accommodate themselves to this at all, but rather gave this short answer: I could do what I wanted, if I did not accord them the viewing and the legal recognition to deal with the body according to their custom, they would have to leave house and home, because by the time a gracious resolution was received from Belgrade, perhaps the entire village, and this was already supposed to have happened in Turkish times, could be destroyed by such an evil spirit, and they did not want to wait for this. Since I could not hold such people from the resolution they had made, either with good words or with threats, I went to the village of Kisilova, taking with them the Gradish Pope, and viewed the body of Peter Blagojevic, just exhumed, finding in accordance through truthfulness that first of all I did not detect the slightest odour that is otherwise characteristic of the dead, and of the body except for the nose, which was somewhat fallen away, was completely fresh. The hair and the beard, even the nails, of which the old ones had fallen away, had grown on him. The old skin, which was somewhat whitish, had peeled away, and a new fresh one had emerged under it. The face, the hands, and the feet, and the whole body were so constituted, they could not have been more than complete in his lifetime. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth, which according to the common observation he had sucked from the people killed by him. In short, all the indications were present that such people, as remarked above, are said to have. After above, the Pope and I had seen this spectacle, while the people grew more outraged and distressed, all of the subject with great speed sharpened a stake, in order to pierce the corpse of the deceased within it, and put this at his heart, whereupon he was pierced. Not only did more blood completely fresh flow also through his ears and mouth, but such other wild signs, which I passed by out of high respect, took place. Finally, according to their usual practice, they burned the oft-mentioned body to ashes, of which I inform the most laudable administration, and to the same time would like to request obediently and humbly that if a mistake was made in this matter, such as to be attributed not to me, but by the rabble who were beside themselves with fear. So here we can see a fairly characteristic case of a vampire being presented as the start of an epidemic, though as Paul Barber noted in his work, the actual vampirism exhibited basically boils down to we found a corpse that hadn't decayed as much as we thought it should have. So the second major case occurred in the aftermath of all this, but this was only the date of reporting. So the actual investigation in this case didn't take place until several years after the fact. So it took place in the village of Medvedja and concerned a man by the name of Arnold Paul. So Paul was a former Serbian soldier or Hajduk who had returned and settled in his native village, where he died in 1727 after the hay wagon he was driving on overturned and he broke his neck. Some 20 to 30 days after his death, however, it was reported that he rose from his grave and killed 4 people. Now, where Paul's case differs from the previous one is that we actually have some details of his claimed behaviour prior to his death. So specifically, he is said to have been plagued by a vampire himself, and indeed that he went to great lengths in order to rid himself of this. So it was said that this included consuming dirt from the grave of the vampire, and when this did not work, he attempted to cure himself by smearing himself with its blood. After the deaths, his body was exhumed on the 40th day, since it was buried, and found to be undecayed. So according to the later report, written by the authorities, fresh blood also flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, ears, and more blood covered his grave clothes, his shroud and his coffin, and his nails and skin had fallen off to expose new ones in their place. Judging him on this appearance to be a vampire, those present drove a stake through his heart, at which point he gave out an audible groan and blood poured from within him. After those present burned his body and scattered its ashes in the graves, then proceeded to do the same for each of his victims, to be sure. However, what's significant about this case is that this did not prevent a second wave of vampire attacks from breaking out some years later, in 1731, and it is in fact this wave of attacks that led to the actual official investigation, which was carried out by a medical team sent by the Austrian authorities. So according to their report, which was compiled by Officer Johann Flukinger, it was claimed that in addition to feeding on humans, Arnold Paul had also fed on animals, and that in time more vampires arose due to people consuming these creatures' flesh. The result is that over the course of several months, a total of 17 people, young and old, passed away, some of whom had shown no prior sign of illness, but instead expired rapidly over only 2 or 3 days. So amongst these was a girl named Joviza, who was said to have laid down to sleep fresh and healthy, only to start to wake suddenly at midnight with a terrible cry and complain that she had been throttled by the son of a local soldier named Milo, who had himself died 9 weeks earlier. After this, she began to experience a great pain in her chest and gradually grew weaker until she died 3 days later. In response to this death and others, the medical team proceeded to open several of the graves of suspected vampires to examine the conditions. Their report notes that some of these bodies were then dissected, with Vluckinger apparently conducting at least one dissection himself of a woman named Stana, who had died during childbirth. According to his report, before death this woman had attempted to protect herself by again smearing her body with the blood of a known vampire, but despite this her body was found to be undecayed, with a large quantity of liquid blood still within her pectoral cavity. In addition, her body also carried many of the other hallmarks of a vampire, e.g. the shedding of the nails and skin, and in another instance an older woman by the name of Melisa was said to have been found plump and fresh within her grave, despite having been known to be very lean during life. Obviously, all of these were taken as signs of vampirism. So, after the exhumations were concluded, the bodies that were judged to be vampires had their heads cut off by what the report describes as the local gypsies, as in the Romani, which is one of the kind of first threads we kind of see of the Romani people being kind of associated with later vampire lore, and the bodies were burned, with the ashes being thrown into the river Morava. So, as with the earlier case, this account obviously carries many of the hallmarks of your typical vampire scare. However, if we put aside, again, the hearsay regarding the death of Arnold Paul, which was not observed by the medical team, what we actually have is a case of a number of people dying suddenly within a community in 2 separate outbreaks, and a number of bodies, again, simply being found not to have decayed to the level that they would have been expected to. There may be a potential explanation for this, as I will go into later. So, these 2 accounts quickly became famous throughout Europe. In particular, the Arnold Paul case was published in the Glenier Historique, which was a French-language journal published in the Netherlands. This journal basically made its name on publishing articles on vampirism in the course of 1732, and its work ended up being republished in a wide number of journals throughout Austria and Germany, then later being translated and published in English and French. The Peter Blagojevic case similarly was published in a Viennese paper called Wienerreich Diarim in July 1725, and similarly was translated and circulated widely throughout Northern and Western Europe. 1732 also saw a large number of scholarly works being published on the topic of vampirism, which continued in succeeding years. In Britain, the Paul case was reported in the London Journal on March 11, 1732, as, quote, a horror story from Heiducken, which I think is a misconception of the term for soldier in the area. Heiducken in Hungary, namely of dead bodies sucking, as it were, the blood of the living, for the latter visibly dry up, whilst the former are filled with blood. So this and other stories would contribute to something of a vampire mania in parts of the British upper class, and it was said that this was believed by figures such as King George II, who himself was of German origin, and the Elector of the State of Hanover. It is also around this time that the word vampire seems to have entered the English language. It would go on in decades to be used in a political sense, and also used often in conjunction with religion. So throughout the remainder of the 18th century, similar claimed outbreaks of vampirism were reported. So, for example, in Croatia in 1737, the island of Lastovo was struck by a severe case of dysentery that was blamed on a vampire, and that would result in a number of corpses being exhumed and decapitated. In the years 1754 to 56, vampire outbreaks were also reported throughout the regions of Wallachia, the Banat, and Moravia, including the case of a woman named Rosina Polakin from the village of Hermersdorf. So upon being exhumed, her body was found to still have liquid blood within its veins, which resulted in her family members dragging it by a hook through a hole in the local churchyard wall, after which they decapitated it and burned the remains. So in 1749, as part of increasing church backlash to these reports, Pope Benedict XIV declared vampires to be, quote, fallacious fictions of human fantasy, and his work on the beatifaction of the servants of God and on the canonization of the beatified. And by the mid-1750s, direct action to address these exhumations could no longer really be avoided. So in 1755, the Empress Maria Theresa, herself a devout Catholic, dispatched 2 doctors, Johannes Gasser and Christian Fabst, to investigate the outbreaks and report to her personal physician and head surgeon of the military, Gerard van Swieten. Luckily, van Swieten was a frank rationalist, and he would go on to write a treatise on vampires where he basically attributed it all to superstition and mass hysteria. So, based on the reports he received, he recommended that it be decreed that those suspected of vampirism and other crimes should not be executed, and that books on witchcraft and demonology be banned. The result was that on March 1st, 1755, the Empress decreed that vampires were figments of the imagination and that no evidence of supernatural activity had been found. The staking and burning of corpses was banned, and cases involving vampirism were removed from the jurisdiction of the regional court and of the religious courts, and after resulting further decrees, the appellate courts also began to throw out vampirism cases as unsubstantiated. Around the same time, many traditional witch hunting practices were also effectively banned, meaning that both vampirism and witchcraft were effectively made visible in the official eyes of the government. So over the rest of the 18th century, the wave of enthusiasm for accounts of vampire outbreaks in Europe would gradually die down. So one factor in this was that after this initial wave of enthusiasm dissipated, doctors and scholars largely started to become more skeptical of the idea of vampirism. So after the initial wave of popularity, there was something of an effort by various scholars to medicalize vampirism, and a number of possible different definitions and lists of symptoms were bandied about. However, over time, after no clear set of symptoms were agreed upon, reports of vampirisms increasingly became seen in light of good old-fashioned Western European prejudices against Eastern Europe. So for centuries by that point, Eastern Europe had been characterized as a superstitious and credulous place by people in Western Europe. A lot of this seems to be based on the fact that the Orthodox Church was prevalent throughout much of the region. And basically between these attitudes and various governments of Eastern Europe putting measures in place to prevent the bodies of claimed vampires being defiled, this led to a slow drop in interest in these cases until they largely died out. And as a kind of closing point of my section, in 1764, the writer Voltaire would even lampoon the idea of vampires in his philosophical dictionary, which came as part of a much longer attack on the concept. So the little quote I have here is, "If there is in this world a well-attested account, it is that of the vampires. Nothing in lacking, official reports, affidavits of well-known people, of surgeons, of priests, of magistrates, the judicial proof is most complete. And with all that, who is there who believes in vampires?" The end result of all of this was that the first popular wave of interest in vampire folklore largely died out in Europe by the end of the 18th century, and it would take the later literary reinvention of the vampire in the 19th century by authors such as John William Polidori with his short story The Vampire, and of course the works of Bram Stoker to revive it. So inevitably, one question that you ask yourself whilst you're reading about these sort of vampire outbreaks and folklore is, are there some possible explanations for these supposed incidents that go beyond simple superstition and figments of the imagination of the people reporting them? Well, there have been various attempts by scholars and even medical professionals to explain the events that may lead to potential vampire outbreaks. In particular, a lot of scholars have pointed to the poor understanding of the processes of decomposition as they were known in Europe during the time, and in particular how these processes can vary in speed. So obviously the rate at which a body decomposes can vary quite widely depending on the time of year that they were buried, or the conditions of the burial soil itself, if the individual was buried in a coffin or if they were buried simply in a shroud. the easiest example to point to is if someone is buried in the cooler part of the year, their body is likely to stay, fresher for longer, just because of the colder conditions. For example, I should point out the bodies that were exhumed during the Arnold Paul case were actually exhumed in winter. So there's a pretty good explanation as to why some of the bodies may have been in better condition. In addition to this, a couple of explanations that are a bit more conjecture have been pointed out. So it has been claimed that bodies that are buried in hot conditions in materials such as clay, sand, mud, or silt can undergo a process where their soft tissues are effectively converted to what is known as adipocere, or cemetery grease, in low oxygen conditions. So normally this is a process that can take months or even years to occur, but there are a few instances known of it happening quite rapidly. And what it basically results in is the body is effectively turned into a cast of itself that makes it appear whole. So that's a slightly more outlandish possibility for why some bodies may have been perceived in this manner. It does not explain things like the fresh expulsion and appearance of blood, however. In addition, decomposing bodies are well known to swell with gases, and the releases of these gases may explain the groans that some reports noted that individuals made when they were staked, or just general reports of vampires groaning or moaning or gibbering within their graves that are sometimes found within Eastern folklore. In addition, people have tried to link the actual physical characteristics claimed by sightings of vampires when they're out and about at their graves to people who are suffering from specific illnesses. So, as mentioned before, vampires in folklore were often associated with the spread of the plague, and there may be a little bit more basis in fact than you would think to this. So, as Paul Barber notes in his book, one of the symptoms of the pneumonic form of the plague is that the victim coughs up large amounts of blood in their saliva, and this may explain the appearance of supposedly fresh bloods on the mouths of either disinterred plague victims or people who are in the final throes of the plague who may be mistaken for vampires. In addition to this, there's been some slightly more fringe theories. One of them is that since the late 1990s, there's a Spanish neurologist by the name of Dr. Juan Gomez Alfonso, who has attempted to link the historical descriptions of vampire encounters with people suffering from the advanced stages of rabies. So, I don't know how familiar you are with rabies, Crofty, but in its final stages, its symptoms can include such things as delirium, paranoia, terror, the presence of hallucinations, a fear of water, partial paralysis, agitation, aggressive behavior, which in some cases can include biting, and eventually collapse into coma and death. In addition to this, there's other claimed diseases that may explain some of these conditions. So, for example, one claimed condition is that of cutaneous porphyria, which most people would probably know of as a much more debilitating variant on the condition that King George III of the United Kingdom is supposedly had that explained his madness. However, it should be noted that many of the claims that have been made around the symptoms of this condition are inaccurate. So a commonly repeated one is that people suffering from cutaneous porphyria have a compulsion to consume blood. This is thought to be completely false. And the kind of final fringe theory I have is that individuals who were mistaken for vampires, it has been claimed, could be suffering from vitamin B3 deficiency, which results in a condition known as pellagra, due to it resulting in their skin becoming basically intolerant to sunlight. However, it should be pointed out that intolerance to sunlight is not a trait associated with folkloric vampires. So this seems unlikely. So some of those accounts that I mentioned before literally include vampires being active between noon and sundown. As a whole, it's not really thought that one of these illnesses in particular can fully explain these outbreaks. So it's thought that in addition to a combination of possible factors like these, there's other more mundane explanations. So one possibility, for example, is people who are impoverished, who have resorted to taking refuge in crypts as living quarters, being mistaken for vampires. Other possibilities include people who were accidentally buried alive, who managed to claw their way out of their grave, and were found in a weakened condition. And the old faithful of all accounts of ghosts and demons and people suffering from poltergeists and stuff like that has also been applied to vampires, and that is people suffering from sleep paralysis. So I, during a period in my 20s, did suffer from sleep paralysis occasionally, where I basically had the classic version where I would seemingly wake up and I would be in my room, and I would be able, I would just, I would have difficulty breathing, and I'd be aware of my surroundings, but I would not be able to move in any meaningful way. I'd be able to slump my body upwards slightly, but that was it, basically. Some people report the feeling of a presence or even visual hallucinations during the course of sleep paralysis. So I can 100% see that being attributed to something like people waking up and claiming they were suffocated by some entity.
Yeah, that crops up with quite a few other creatures and pieces of folklore as well, so it makes sense.
Yeah. And of course, one other reason maybe good old-fashioned hysteria and superstition.
Always a fun one.
Okay, Crofty, so after my incredibly long-winded account there of Slavic traditions of the vampires and how those spread further across Europe, let's now have a bit of a look further afield.
Thank you, Charles. I'd use the word thorough because, we want to be talking positively about our own podcast.
Yes.
And also because as thorough as I've tried to be for this next section, it's a lot of small scattered references and things where there is very little information on. And I really hope there are historians and folklorists out there finding more on this stuff so that in 10 years' time I can read more on it. So before I go into my whistle-stop tour around the world, I am going to reiterate the point that we made at the start, in that a lot of these accounts are very heavily influenced by European colonialism. I've tried to, where possible, find original accounts or translations of original accounts and original mentions, but these are unfortunately quite rare. There will be creatures that have been described by modern writers as vampires that I've missed out. I've basically gone for the ones that I could find mentioned in as many modern sources as I could, and then gone back into the folklore as best I can. And I will often be pointing out that these things don't meet both of our criteria that we mentioned at the start.
Mm-hmm.
So with all of those disclaimers, I'm going to start with vampiric creatures in Africa. And I will say that all vampires in Africa were wiped out in 1982, when Toto blessed the rains down in Africa.
What a sad, sad day for vampire kind.
And if that joke gets me fired for being terrible, worth it. Sorry, serious face.
Serious vampire face, yeah.
So, in Africa, the main creatures that I've been able to find that have been described as having vampiric traits are clustered around Western Africa, particularly from the folklore of the Ashanti tribe in the region around what's now Ghana. One of these creatures, which European writers have described as a blood-drinking witch, is known as the Obayifo by the people of Ghana, and also by the name the Asiman. These witches were humans who were living in the community, who had gained the ability to leave their body and travel at night as a glowing light, and in this form they would attack children and drink their blood. Usually this would be done quite gradually, so as not to be noticeable, and according to some sources, this was done in a way that the victim felt pain but never showed any physical mark of the attack. Some of these witches were also said to suck out the heart. Scholars have attributed these abilities to explanations for slow-acting poisons or to diseases such as tuberculosis. These witches were also thought to be able to preserve their bodies in death and inhabit their dead body. So, it does actually meet both of our criteria.
Yeah, it technically counts. Yeah. Technically correct, the best type of correct.
Yep, and I realised I went through all that disclaimer and then the first one does actually meet the criteria.
Yeah.
I'm off to a great start. As well as this, these witches could raise the dead as their servants or familiars through disinterring the body, cutting out the tongue, and driving a peg into its brain, and it would bind these creatures to them as a ghoul-like creature that was known as an Isthfuntela or an Impundulu, which was also thought to either drink blood or eat the flesh of dead humans. The Ashanti tribes do also have legends of a more monstrous creature that has been described as a vampire, which is known as either the Asanbosam or the Sasabonsam. The first descriptions in English of these creatures were by the anthropologist Mary Kingsley in 1899, when she supposedly encountered one near the Ogowe River in Gabon in West Central Africa. She described the creature as walking towards them down the forest path, and her local companion, upon seeing it, jumped into the bushes in order to give the figure a wide berth. The figure had a humanoid form, with one side diseased and rotting, and the other side in perfect health. And Kingsley stated that it all depends on which side you brush against him, whether you see the dawn again or no. According to her, due to the narrowness of the paths in these places, it was impossible in some places to pass by without brushing against the Sasabonsam. And as they were only out at night, you couldn't often see which side was the rotting side. And so if you touched the rotting side, it would then carry you away to its lair and eat you. This is also backed up by an earlier reference in her book where she describes blood on the ground as having been said to been left there by a Sasabonsam, which was dragging its victim to the underworld to feast on it. The anthropologist and barrister Robert Sutherland Rattray, who himself quoted Kingsley's description in his book Religion and Art in Ashanti, describes the Sasabonsam as having long hair, large bloodshot eyes, and hooked long feet that it dangles from trees in order to grab unsuspecting victims. Rattray says that the name is derived from Sasa, meaning spirit surviving after death, and Lonsam, which is a male witch. However, while Kingsley and Rattray's descriptions of the Sasabonsam focus on it as an evil predatory creature, this is our first example of a European and Christian modification of a creature that had a much different role in the original folklore. According to the folklorist Genevieve Nrenza, who is a research fellow at the University of Ghana's Institute of African Studies, she gives a similar physical description to Rattray: long-haired, tall humanoid, hooked feet, also mentioning that it uses these feet to hang upside down like a bat, and mentions pointed bat-like ears and a mouth full of sharp iron teeth. She says that it stalks its prey through the trees, often playing with its prey like a cat, until it finally strikes from the trees, lifting its prey into the branches, biting their neck, draining their blood, and eating their flesh.
So, Crofty, for your first few major things that you've managed to pick, despite talking about how so few of them were kind of pure vampires, you've described stuff that sounds incredibly vampiric so far.
Yes, but the next part about this particular creature changes things slightly. Don't worry. I'm going to prove myself wrong, or right. Yes. I lost my own train of thought. So, as you have just said, Charles, we have finally seen the vampiric trait of blood drinking in this particular creature. However, according to Nrenza, the Akan people, of which the Ashanti tribe were a part, believed that the Sasanbosam was actually a guardian rather than an undead monster. It was created by the Ashanti goddess Asasea, who was the goddess of the land and fertility. And it would only hunt people who broke the taboo of entering the forest on a Thursday. This day was a sacred day to Asasea, and on her sacred day, humans were expected to leave the forest to replenish itself and to allow the spirits and the deities to roam freely. So the Sasanbonsam, in its role as a divine protector, would punish those who broke the taboo, disturbed the replenishment of the land, or tried to hunt or gather within the forest. I will also briefly mention, while we're in Africa, that there are scattered mentions in by modern writers that describe the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, supposedly the first vampire story. And while Sekhmet does at one point go on a rampage and drink a lot of blood, that's part of a much larger story of her role as a goddess that is way too complex to go into here, probably deserves its own episode, but is very much related to her history as a goddess, and so we really can't count as a vampire here.
Because you say we've got the blood sucking, we haven't got the undead component.
Yeah, it's not even blood sucking so much as a lot of blood getting spilled and her then drinking it after the fact. So it does seem to be very much modern writers clutching at straws for an ancient origin of vampires here. Moving on, and heading up to India, there are a few creatures in Hindu mythology that have been described by modern writers as vampiric. The first and oldest of these are the Rakshasas, which are fanged cannibalistic creatures that, according to legend, inhabited India before the migration of the Proto-Indo-Iranian people, which were precursors to the Vedic civilization in the 2nd and 3rd millennium BC. And these are mentioned in various encyclopedias of vampires by folklorists such as Aubrey Sherman and Theresa Bain. On looking into this, however, these ones don't seem to meet either of the criteria of the vampire, and looked and found sections of the Rig Veda, one of the earliest Vedic texts, which describes them as demons, in that it describes wars between the gods and by the Rakshasas and their demonic masters, particularly in the stories of the god Rama and the Rakshasa king Ravana. This text does mention cannibalism and describe the Rakshasas as cannibals, but never refers to them drinking blood. The only references to blood drinking I can find are mentions of artwork depicting Rakshasas, but I can't even find those particular paintings to actually see the images, so can't really say they are blood drinkers. If you want to give a Western comparison, ogre would be a much more appropriate one.
Yeah.
In fact, some of the descriptions put them as quite similar to the Japanese oni, which are also described as ogre-like.
Yep, covered handily in our episode on yokai. Go watch it.
Yeah. Two other creatures that have been described as vampires in Indian folklore that do fit the undead description are the Bhuta and the Vatala. The Bhuta are described as the deceased forms of people who went insane or who were killed suddenly in accidents. They were thought to be found in ruins and thought to feed on the flesh of corpses. And much like other vampires, they were quite often blamed for drought, for famine or disease. The Vatala were thought to be variants of the Bhuta, and both of these are described by the late 19th century folklorist William Crook as often approximates to the vampire as we meet him in Western folklore. He says that the Vatala is a vitalized corpse, that the visitor from the other world comes to trouble mankind, often subject to human appetites, constantly endowed with more than human strength and malignity. So the pause was because I just realised how bad his grammar was.
Yeah, I had that a few times with the report that I was reading verbatim beforehand. They put commas in strange places.
Yeah, or just slightly odd word order. The major story about a Vatala that I can find is when it forms part of the frame story for the collection called the Baital Pachisi, or Vatala Tales, which is an 11th century collection similar to the 1001 Nights, in which a frame story is given and a character within the frame story then tells several other tales. In this story, King Vikramaditya, or King Vikram, who is described as a figure of Indian legend similar to our King Arthur, is sent by a sorcerer to capture a Vatala who is living in a tree in a graveyard, who is inhabiting bodies and terrorizing the locals. However, on each attempt, the Vatala makes a bargain with King Vikram, in which he will tell King Vikram a story that will end in a riddle. If Vikram cannot answer the riddle, the Vatala will remain captive. If Vikram knows the answer but keeps silent, his head shall explode. And if Vikram answers the riddle correctly, the Vatala may escape. 24 times, King Vikram successfully answers the riddle, but on the 25th attempt, Vikram is unable to answer.
Of course, if you have 25 tries, you're going to win.
Yeah, even though technically by winning, the Vatala loses because he agrees.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
He agrees that if he can stump King Vikram, Vikram gets to keep him captive. It's an odd one.
Yeah.
I imagine there is some larger significance that I can't find in the summaries that I found, because the main English translation, or adaptation rather, of this was quite heavily edited into Vikram and the Vampire, written by Sir Richard Francis Burton. So I think in that version of the text a lot was lost in translation.
Yeah, perhaps thanks to a pair of scissors. Yeah.
To conclude the story of Vikram, on the way returning to take the Vatala back to the sorcerer, the Vatala tells Vikram his story, in that he was one of a pair of twins who were born after his parents, who could not conceive, made a bargain with a sorcerer, in which the sorcerer's condition was that he would educate the sons. The Vatala was badly mistreated by the sorcerer, while his brother was treated well. And the Vatala learned that the sorcerer intended to sacrifice him in order to complete a spell, in order to gain immortality and rule the world. Vikram then learns from the Vatala that the sorcerer intends to complete the spell by sacrificing him instead, after destroying the reanimated Vatala, and so Vikram tricks the sorcerer into exposing his neck and beheading him. As payment for saving his unlife, as it were, the Vatala promises King Vikram his aid whenever it's needed. Stories such as this one, or mentions of the Bhuta being people who died in accidents or died because of madness, do show a more sympathetic view of vampire-like creatures that Western authors generally didn't have when writing about the folklore. And it sort of acknowledges really that the fate of the vampire was, or the vampiric creature, was as bad or as worse than that of their victims.
Mm.
However, I will say I can't find reference to this Vatala drinking any blood at any point, so it only fits one of our two criteria. With that, we carry on further into Asia and head into China. Chinese folklore does have quite a unique variety of vampiric creature, the Zhang Shi, which English writers refer to as the hopping vampire. This is the only type of undead that I've ever heard of where rigor mortis actually sets in, because the Zhang Shi have quite a distinctive image of a stiff body in a burial shroud with its arms permanently outstretched, and it's only able to move by hopping. It was thought to kill people by absorbing their chi, or their life force, which, as we mentioned before, we will allow a bit of leeway when we have mystical life forces, rather than blood. However, I will also note that one meaning of chi is quite literally life air, or life breath, and there are two stories, one called Living Dead and one called Spraying Water, in which the method of absorbing the life force of the victims was to steal their breath either through blowing away all of the air surrounding the victim or through spraying them with enough water to drown them. There were several reasons that a corpse could return to life in this form, according to the 18th century scholar Zhou Xiaolan, which included absorption of yang energy. It included the Po, which was a part of the soul which contains a person's animalistic instincts, remaining with the body after death. It included a improper burial, or a burial away from the person's home soil, or resurrection through the actions of a sorcerer. The folklorist Teresa Bain does also list a few which might sound familiar from earlier on, including a cat jumping over the corpse. I can't find any older reference to that, so it might be a migration from the European accounts.
Yeah, I do know there was a general thought in European folklore that cats needed to be kept away from corpses because they would try to attack them. That came up during the course of my research, but obviously I'm pretty certain those two are not connected if it's going from China.
Yeah, that's it. Either this did evolve independently in China, or the two have been mixed together by modern writers.
Possibly.
Like I say, I don't have an older source, unfortunately. There are scattered mentions of methods of stopping the Zhang Shi, though again, these I can't find any older or more reliable sources for, so can't confirm how many of them are actually part of the original folklore. One that I've found quite commonly is sticking a Taoist paper talisman to its forehead, which is quite commonly seen in Chinese and Korean cinema as methods of defeating evil spirits. One method I've seen, again similar to something you've mentioned, is the Zhang Shi being defeated by mirrors as it fears its own reflection. I mentioned earlier about one vampiric creature that cannot cross a threshold. The Zhang Shi was thought to be unable to cross a threshold, but for practical reasons, in that thresholds in old Chinese houses were about 6 to 10 centimetres high.
Oh, yes, so it couldn't physically hop over them, yeah.
Exactly, if you're unable to bend your legs, hopping over that small distance wasn't really possible, and also gives a nice slapstick image of a vampire chasing someone only to trip over and being able to get up.
I was going to say, I had a humorous account of my own involving vampires that I never got to mention, but in Eastern European folklore, there's like a tradition of vegetables and objects being turned into vampires as well. So that just suddenly made me think of that, where it's like, this is supposed to be a scary supernatural entity. And my image of it is Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein.
Yeah. And one final weakness, which is where I had originally intended to make my Count Von Count impression, is that supposedly if you drop coins on the floor, the Zhang Shi must stop and count them. So I was going to mention it developing a bad Bela Lugosi voice, but
yeah,
I've already dropped that earlier. This superstition may actually stem from a much older belief that was based on a real ritual practice, in which Taoist priests would temporarily resurrect and bind a person's body if they had died far from their homeland. In older Chinese beliefs, burial in the soil of their homeland was an important part of how a person would pass on to the afterlife. And so if a person died far from home, potentially because they were serving in war or had travelled far from home for work, they needed to be returned. There were quite a lot of superstitions about corpses bring ill fortune, particularly looking upon a corpse. And so this meant that most people were quite reluctant to transport a corpse by regular means without a large fee. And so Taoist priests would be hired in order to walk the corpse home. The belief was that the priest would use a spell in order to temporarily resurrect the corpse. They would bind its feet together and bind its arms outstretched for balance so it could only hop along. The priest would then usually lead quite a long procession of corpses in their ritual shrouds from village to village, with a second priest bringing up the rear of the procession. They would only travel at night, and the priests would ring bells in order to warn passers-by of their approach, in order to ensure that nobody looked upon the corpse. In reality, these corpses would actually be tied at the arms to 2 bamboo poles, which were carried on the shoulders by a priest at each end. And so the hopping motion would be from the rising and falling of the bamboo poles with the priest's footsteps, and also the image of the arms outstretched based on how they were tied together. This practice actually continued as late as the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A first-hand account of this was given in a book called The Corpse Walker, Real-Life Stories of China from the Bottom Up, by Lao Yiwu. Please forgive the pronunciation. He interviews a person who, in the early 1950s, met 2 priests who were transporting a corpse. By this point, it was a rare enough practice that the priests were transporting a single corpse rather than an entire procession. For this method of transport, one priest would carry the corpse on his back, with the shroud covering the entire body and covering his own face, and so the other priest led and used the bell in order to guide the priest who was carrying the body. This practice finally ended during the crackdown on traditional superstitious practices in the early days of Chairman Mao's regime. And so I think that account is one of the very last written accounts. And with that, we will leave China and head southeast to the Philippines, to Indonesia and Malaysia, which I'll be covering as a single group because they have quite a lot of crossover in their folklore. So, across this area of Southeast Asia, there's quite a bit of folklore on a broadly similar group of vampiric creatures, which also includes the only creature I can find that is explicitly described as a vampire by an indigenous writer. A Filipino folklorist by the name of Maximo Ramos, who studied at the University of the Philippines in Quezon City and the University of the East in Manila, wrote several books and papers on creatures of Filipino legends and folklore, and on shared folklore between the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. As a whole, he used the term aswang as an umbrella term for several creatures that he did also list European equivalents of, including witches, shapeshifters, and vampires. So it's important to note that his use of the word vampire was intended to provide a more simple classification to quite a large range of beliefs spread across several thousand islands and several thousand ethnic groups within those islands, and so to make them a bit more accessible to other English-speaking scholars and a broader audience. So he describes three particular archetypes of Filipino vampire. The first he describes as taking on the form of a beautiful maiden who marries an unsuspecting young man and slowly feeds on a small amount of his blood each night over months or years until he dies of anemia before finding herself a new husband. These vampires have a point on the tip of their tongue which they use to pierce the skin, and they suck the blood through the tongue, sort of like the proboscis on a mosquito.
Ugh.
Not pleasant. The second archetype also marries a young man, but instead only uses him to provide a home, and instead this creature flies far away every night to feed, so as not to arouse suspicion by feeding on her own husband or on the neighbours. These two archetypes aren't described as undead at any point, not really given a classification of undead, demon, or anything similar, so unsure whether they can fully count. The third archetype, however, is explicitly described as an undead or as a revenant, and this archetype sleeps during the day in the forests, far from human settlement, and it ventures into towns at night once a week in order to drink blood. But he doesn't give any more information on this particular vampire's physiology, whether it's female only, female and male, male only. But if we assume that these are variations on the same creature, it's likely female only, and does also then mean that the other two archetypes are undead. The names for these creatures vary throughout the Philippines. They include the Amalanhig among the West Visayan people, the Danag among the Isneg people, and the Mandarugo, which literally translates as bloodsucker, among the Tagalog people. There is another class of creatures that European and American writers will describe as vampires that are found in the folklore of the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, under various names, and which Ramos describes as viscera suckers. So I'm going to include them here because they show some similarities. These creatures do appear quite different to the vampires that he describes, in that they all share the common feature that the head or torso separates from the lower body at night, often sprouts wings, which it uses to fly to the houses of its victims. Similar to the Filipino vampire, it uses its tongue in order to suck blood, phlegm, and or internal organs from its victims. Accounts of these particular creatures go back at least to the 16th century, where Spanish missionaries made records of the customs and folklore of the Filipino people. These creatures also have a variety of names, including the Naguneg, the Lamanluob, the Manangal, and the Srey Ap, which is Cambodian, literally meaning on human excreta. And the other name for them, which has come into more common usage in modern writing, is the Penangalan, which is descended from the Malay word tanggal, meaning to detach. Similar to the Filipino vampire, it looks like an attractive woman during the daytime, with the only unusual feature being its unusually long tongue. It may marry a man and be provided with a home or live in the forests. During the day, it will go out and mark a house as its target. Then at night, will separate from its body, fly to the marked house, land on the roof, extend its tongue through a hole in the roof thatch, elongate it, and search out the mouth of the sleeping victim before proceeding down the throat to feed. There are some variants, particularly as I mentioned in Cambodia, which feed exclusively on the phlegm of sick people, particularly asthmatic people or those suffering from tuberculosis. Of the creatures that target healthy people, they will feed on the heart, on the blood, the liver, the lungs, the spleen, and the entrails. The weakness of this particular creature is that when it discards its legs are then stuck in place. It has to conceal them either beneath a bedsheet or in a closet if it's indoors, or if outdoors, it would supposedly conceal them in a banana grove. And to defeat the creature, you had to either sprinkle the legs with ashes, vinegar, spices, or salt, which would prevent the creature from reattaching to its legs unless it can persuade a human to clean the legs with water before dawn. And supposedly simply moving the legs from their original position would also defeat the creature, because it would be unable to find them and would die being unable to reattach. These partially fit our criteria for vampires, in that there are accounts of them feeding on blood, but as they also feed on organs and phlegm, and aren't necessarily described as undead, I think this is more just a case of modern writers, again, combining them with the Filipino vampires that we discussed. And regular listeners might notice another callback to our yokai episode.
Yeah, I was going to say.
They bear similarity to the Nukekubi, which we discussed, which would detach its head.
Pulley neck, yeah.
Yeah, or the Rikurokubi.
Sorry, I think I'm confusing two creatures.
I can't remember which is which either, so mentioning both, because one is the extendable neck, one is the removing head. I forget. I have the book within reach, and I
same.
keep forgetting. Finally, to conclude my section, we come to the Americas, particularly South and Central America. Most creatures that I can find here do seem to have originated following the arrival of European colonists, and they do quite often have Catholic influences rather than being indigenous to the continent. And it seems to essentially be European influences combining with a indigenous bit of folklore to create something that modern writers are now calling vampires. So, what's possibly the most famous of these various entities is the Chupacabra in Mexico. The name was actually first used, from what I can find, in a report by the governor of New Galicia in 1540, in which he described an attack by a large number of small, dark-scaled men carrying torches and spears. And the only other attribute he described in them was their ability to cover large distances in a single leap. And he called them Chupacabra. There is nothing here to fit any vampire criteria. Nope. And the very obvious explanation is that these were warriors of an indigenous tribe and that he was a racist.
Yeah. He got beat up by some guys and decided to make up a story.
Yes. And decided, yep, these are clearly supernatural.
No, I didn't get drunk and fall asleep in the graveyard. It was a ghost.
I'm not just a terrible leader.
Yeah.
It was monsters, honest.
Yeah.
So while this was where the name was coined, it would later on get applied to quite a large number of creatures, which include a fox-like animal with bat wings and cat eyes and blue skin, or a type of furless canine. And the only connection that causes these varieties of creature to be listed as vampire is that the only reported victims are either livestock or pets which were found with a small bite mark and completely drained of blood. I will note that this was from the Theresa Bain book, The the Encyclopedia of Vampire Mythology, and she does mention quite a long list of creatures that she says are types of vampire, but don't fit our criteria.
Yeah.
The main reason I'm mentioning the Chupacabra is because it is quite a well-known one.
Yeah, I expected it might show up if we end up doing like a dedicated cryptids episode or anything like that, but
Yeah.
seems like we don't really need to now.
Well, if I had time to go further into the more modern sightings and reports,
Yeah.
We could probably count it in the same category as Bigfoot, Mothman, etc. if we did a general cryptids episode.
Yeah.
Next, we'll briefly head to Brazil, in which there are two creatures which get listed as vampires, and again, both do seem to be influenced by the Catholic Church. One is the Ayara, which is the resurrected form of a person who died violently, died unbaptized, or who was buried in the jungle. This creature lures men into the jungle with its song, similar to a Greek siren. If the victim recognizes the trap quickly enough, he can recite a protective chant, but if not, he's hypnotized by the song. The Ayara then transforms into a snake and drains the man of blood, leaving his body by a river to be discovered. The other creature is the Jaracas, which also takes the form of a snake, but this creature attacks breastfeeding mothers, putting its tail into the baby's mouth to prevent it crying while it drains the mother's milk. When it can't feed on a mother, it attacks men and feeds on a small amount of blood, just enough to sustain itself until it can find a better victim. Victims, whether they are breastfeeding mothers or men, will grow weaker as it feeds, but will recover quite easily once the Jaracas moves on to other prey. But any mothers who it has fed on will discover that her milk has dried up. The ways of driving off a Jaracas are either Catholic prayers or the blessings of a Catholic priest, but it can't be killed. Similarly, Catholic prayers and crosses can ward off the Ayara. So while the Ayara resembles a vampire the most, because of the connection with the Catholic Church, I think it's likely that it was brought over from Europe and the story merged with that of the Jaracas, rather than being a vampire in its own right. And finally, in the Caribbean, we have a creature called the Sucuyant, which appears in the folklore of African communities in Dominica, Trinidad, and Guadeloupe. The Sucuyant appears as an old woman who strips off her skin at night, transforming into a ball of light, which then enters the home of a victim and drinks their blood while they sleep. And these are again thought to be imported from Europe, with French vampire lore merging with a type of African spirit known as a jumbi, which appears similar to the ball of light form of the Sucuyant. And with that, I think that's an end to my section. There are a lot of creatures that I've not mentioned that there are individual references calling them a vampire that I can't really find any more information on. The ones I've covered are the ones where there is at least some vague connection that I can find, however tenuous it might be. I did better than I expected in terms of ones that do fit our criteria. There were 3.
Yeah, there were a few of them in there.
Yeah.
So there was something going on, but I think the idea that there is like a common archetype of a supernatural undead creature that drinks blood is perhaps more of a Eurocentric concept than the supposedly worldwide mythology that in some places has been claimed.
Yeah, I think calling a lot of these things vampires really does an injustice to the original folklore. I'd like to hope that if more people become interested in these things in the future, that we'll actually be able to find more information on the original folklore rather than the very westernized versions.
Yeah. So before we actually end this episode and leave the topic of New World possible vampires entirely, there is one American example of vampirism that we've sort of glossed over in this episode because it's more rooted in my side of things, the Eastern European tradition of vampires, and it kind of meant it didn't fit so well with Crofty's episode. So to avoid me repeating myself a whole bunch, because a lot of the events that happen for these vampires are very similar to the ones I've described for the Eastern European vampires, we did not really discuss the various vampire panics that occurred in New England and America from the end of the 18th century through to the end of the 19th century. We're not really going to cover this today for the sake of time. We've already gone on for quite long enough. If anyone else is interested in that, there were a series of very similar outbreaks to the ones I described in Eastern Europe that occurred in New England. There's an episode of the podcast, The Dollop, I think it's episode number 7, where they go into it in detail. So they did like an hour and something long episode on those. So if you want to hear more about different types of vampires and vampires occurring in slightly different circumstances, then maybe check that out. Okay, Crofty. So I think that probably brings us to the end of our exploration of vampires, and I cannot help but notice that the dawn light is appearing on the horizon. So it is probably best that we retire back to our crypts before the start of the next episode.
I don't want to burst into flames.
No, it's, it's an occupational hazard.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Thank you for listening, and we will talk to you again soon. Oh, wait a minute. We're supposed to give a hint, aren't we, for the next episode? But I don't think you've picked one, have you, Crofty?
No, we have a few options, so I'm just going to have to say, keep an eye on Charles's Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. All right, folks. We'll talk to you again soon.
Good night.